Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to the English Globe, a place where we explore important global events and international issues while helping you improve your English through thoughtful conversations and real-world topics that shape our modern world. And today we are discussing a fascinating and extremely important subject that connects geography, global trade, energy security, and international politics. Because in this episode we are asking a very powerful question that economists, policymakers, and global leaders often think about. What would happen to the world if the Strait of Hormuz were suddenly blocked? And why would such a situation send shockwaves across the global economy within hours?
Hello, everyone. It is wonderful to have you here with us today. And before we begin exploring this complex and fascinating topic, we would like to thank all of our listeners around the world who continue to support the English Globe, because this channel is designed especially for English learners who want to understand global news, international relations, and economic developments in a calm and educational way. So if you enjoy conversations like this that combine English learning with important world events, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and also write a comment telling us which country you are listening from and what you think about today's topic, because we always enjoy seeing how global our audience truly is.
That is absolutely right, Julia. And every time we look at the comments, we are amazed to see listeners joining us from Asia, Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and many other regions of the world, which reminds us that global issues are not just abstract academic discussions, but real challenges that affect people everywhere. And today's question about the Strait of Hormuz is a perfect example of how a small geographic location can influence the stability of the entire global economy, because this narrow waterway plays a role that is far bigger than its physical size might suggest.
Exactly, Adam. And many people who hear the name Strait of Hormuz might not immediately understand why it is so important, because on the map, it appears to be just a narrow passage of water between countries in the Middle East. But in reality, it functions like one of the most critical arteries of the global energy system, since a huge portion of the world's oil exports travels through this small corridor every single day, meaning that tankers carrying energy supplies from major oil-producing countries must pass through this route in order to reach markets in Asia, Europe, and beyond.
And that is where the central question of our episode becomes extremely interesting, because when economists and international security experts discuss global trade routes, they often talk about something called strategic chokepoints, which are narrow passages where a large amount of global trade must pass through, and the Strait of Hormuz is considered one of the most important chokepoints in the entire world, because every day enormous oil tankers carrying energy resources move through this narrow waterway, connecting the energy-rich Persian Gulf to the wider global market.
When you think about it carefully, the importance of this route becomes even more striking, because modern economies depend heavily on stable energy supplies. And oil is not only used for transportation, but also for manufacturing, electricity generation in some regions, chemical industries, shipping networks, aviation systems, and many other parts of the global economy, which means that any disruption in a major energy route could quickly spread beyond the oil industry and begin affecting prices, markets, and economic stability in many countries around the world.
Imagine waking up one morning and seeing global headlines reporting that oil tankers are unable to move through the Strait of Hormuz, and that ships are waiting outside the passage because the route has suddenly become inaccessible. Because even if such a situation lasted only a short time, financial markets would react immediately. Energy traders would start calculating possible shortages. Governments would begin discussing emergency responses, and investors across the world would start asking the same urgent question: how long could the global economy function without one of its most important energy routes?
This is exactly why analysts often describe the Strait of Hormuz as one of the most sensitive points in the global economic system. Because unlike many other trade routes that have several alternative paths, this waterway has very limited substitutes for the enormous volume of oil that passes through it each day. And that means that even the possibility of disruption can influence energy prices and political discussions, since markets tend to react not only to actual events, but also to the risk of future instability.
What makes this topic even more fascinating is that the Strait of Hormuz is not only an economic route, but also a place where geography, politics, and global security intersect in very complex ways, because the countries surrounding the Persian Gulf are among the world's largest energy producers, and their exports travel through this narrow passage toward major consumer economies, such as China, India, Japan, South Korea, and many others, meaning that a local disruption could quickly become a global concern.
When we step back and look at the bigger picture, we begin to see that this small stretch of water is actually connected to some of the most important questions in international relations today, including energy security, maritime trade stability, economic interdependence, and the delicate balance between cooperation and competition among major global powers, which is why discussions about the Strait of Hormuz appear frequently in policy debates, economic forecasts, and international news analysis.
In today's episode, we are going to explore this topic step by step so that our listeners can understand not only where the Strait of Hormuz is located, but also why it matters so deeply for global energy markets, how financial systems might react if the passage were blocked, what economic consequences could follow for different regions of the world, and how governments and international organizations might respond in order to maintain stability and keep global trade flowing.
Our goal is not to create fear or dramatic speculation, but rather to help our listeners understand the structure of the global economy and the role that geography plays in shaping international trade networks. Because when we learn how these systems function, we become better informed citizens of the world who can analyze news events calmly and thoughtfully instead of reacting only to headlines or emotional narratives.
So as we begin this conversation, think about the remarkable reality that a narrow maritime passage only a few kilometers wide carries energy resources that help power cities, industries, and transportation networks across multiple continents, and that the stability of this route depends on a complex mixture of geography, diplomacy, economic cooperation, and international security.
And with that big question in mind, what would happen if the Strait of Hormuz were blocked, and how such an event could ripple through the global economy? Let us begin exploring the geography, strategic importance, and economic role of this critical waterway that quietly supports much of the modern world. Adam, before we move deeper into the economic consequences and global reactions that could happen if this route were ever disrupted, I think it is important for our listeners to clearly understand the geography of the place we are talking about, because many people hear the name Strait of Hormuz in international news but may not fully visualize where it actually is on the world map. And when we look carefully at its location, we realize that this narrow passage sits in one of the most strategically sensitive regions on Earth, positioned between the Persian Gulf and the open waters that lead toward the Indian Ocean, which means that it functions as a gateway through which enormous volumes of global energy exports must travel every single day.
That is a great place to start, Julia, because geography is the key to understanding why this location matters so much in global economics and international relations. And the Strait of Hormuz is essentially a narrow maritime corridor that connects the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman, which then opens into the Arabian Sea and eventually the wider Indian Ocean, meaning that any oil tanker leaving the energy-rich Gulf region and heading toward markets in Asia, Europe, or other parts of the world must first pass through this relatively small waterway before reaching open international shipping routes.
When you look at the map carefully, the geography becomes even more fascinating, because the Strait of Hormuz lies between the southern coast of Iran and the northern coast of Oman. And despite its enormous global importance, the navigational channel used by ships is actually quite narrow, which makes it one of the most significant maritime choke points in the entire global trading system. since huge supertankers carrying millions of barrels of oil must travel through carefully defined shipping lanes in order to safely pass through the strait while avoiding collisions and maintaining steady maritime traffic.
Exactly. And when analysts describe the Strait of Hormuz as a global choke point, they are referring to the fact that an extremely large share of the world's energy exports must pass through this single narrow route. And because there are very limited alternative sea routes available for the oil produced in the Persian Gulf, the strait has become one of the most strategically sensitive areas in global trade, since any disruption in this narrow corridor could affect energy flows that power industries, transportation networks, and economic activity across multiple continents.
Another important aspect of this geography is that several of the world's largest oil exporting countries are located inside the Persian Gulf, and this means that their energy exports depend heavily on the ability of ships to move freely through the Strait of Hormuz, because countries such as Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, and Qatar send a large portion of their oil and natural gas shipments toward international markets through this route, making the strait a central artery for the global energy supply that supports modern economies from East Asia to Europe.
That is correct, and when we consider how much energy moves through this passage every day, we begin to understand why policymakers and economists pay so much attention to the stability of this region, because the oil exported from these Gulf countries is not only important for regional trade, but also essential for global energy markets, meaning that countries thousands of kilometers away, from Japan and South Korea to India and China, depend on the uninterrupted flow of shipments through this single maritime corridor.
What I find particularly interesting is how this example shows that geography is not just about physical landscapes and coastlines, but also about how those landscapes influence political decisions and economic relationships. Because a narrow waterway like the Strait of Hormuz can shape international alliances, security policies, and diplomatic strategies, simply because it sits at the intersection of global energy production and international maritime trade.
You are absolutely right, Julia, and throughout history we can see that control over important sea routes has always been one of the most critical elements of global power, because maritime trade has connected civilizations for centuries, and nations that could secure key shipping lanes often gained economic advantages and strategic influence, which is why international relations scholars frequently study maritime choke points, such as the Strait of Hormuz, the Suez Canal, and other vital routes that link major economic regions of the world.
In many ways, the Strait of Hormuz represents a perfect example of how geography and politics are deeply interconnected, because the countries surrounding the Persian Gulf are among the most important energy producers on the planet, while the economies that depend on their exports are spread across multiple continents, meaning that this narrow passage of water has become a meeting point where regional geography influences global economic stability.
And that connection between geography and global power is exactly why analysts often say that understanding world maps is essential for understanding world politics, because when we identify where resources are produced and how they travel to international markets, we begin to see how strategic routes like the Strait of Hormuz become central to global trade networks, diplomatic discussions, and economic planning.
For our listeners, this also highlights an important lesson about international relations and global economics, because sometimes the most influential places in the world are not the largest countries or the biggest cities, but rather the narrow passages, bridges, canals, and sea routes that quietly connect major regions of the global economy, shaping the movement of goods, energy, and resources that modern societies rely on every day.
So when we talk about the Strait of Hormuz, we are not simply discussing a geographic location on the map of the Middle East, but rather a strategic gateway that links the energy resources of the Persian Gulf with the global marketplace. And this is why governments, economists, and security experts closely monitor developments in this region, since the stability of this narrow corridor plays a vital role in maintaining the steady flow of energy that powers the world economy.
And now that we have explored where the Strait of Hormuz is located and why its geography makes it such a crucial point in global trade, we can begin to examine another important dimension of this topic, which is how deeply the global energy system depends on this route and why so many countries pay close attention to what happens in this small but incredibly important maritime passage.
When we begin examining the economic importance of the Strait of Hormuz, the first thing we must understand is how energy actually moves through this region every day. Because this narrow waterway is not simply a busy shipping route, but one of the most important transportation corridors for the global energy system. And enormous oil tankers carrying crude oil from the Persian Gulf pass through the strait on their way to international markets, transporting energy resources that are produced in countries such as Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar, which means that this maritime passage quietly supports energy flows that power industries, transportation systems, and cities across multiple continents.
What makes the scale of this movement truly remarkable is the sheer volume of energy that travels through the strait every single day. Because when analysts look at global shipping data, they often describe the Strait of Hormuz as the single most important oil transit route in the world. And the reason for this is that a very large share of the oil exported from the Persian Gulf must pass through this narrow passage before reaching open ocean routes that connect to Asia, Europe, and other major energy markets, meaning that the stability of this small corridor has enormous consequences for the balance of supply and demand in the global energy economy.
In addition to crude oil shipments, another crucial form of energy also moves through this waterway, and that is liquefied natural gas, often known as LNG, which is natural gas that has been cooled into liquid form so it can be transported efficiently by specialized ships across long distances. And many LNG carriers depart from export terminals in the Gulf region and travel through the Strait of Hormuz toward major importing countries, demonstrating that this maritime route is not only essential for oil trade, but also plays a vital role in supplying natural gas to economies that depend on imported energy.
When we look at global trade statistics, we discover that approximately 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas trade also passes through this single maritime route, which means that energy shipments traveling through the Strait of Hormuz include not only crude oil, but also natural gas that helps fuel electricity generation, heating systems, industrial production, and many other aspects of modern life, showing us that this narrow waterway has become one of the most important energy arteries in the entire global economy.
Another interesting aspect of this energy flow is that the countries receiving these shipments are some of the largest and most industrialized economies in the world, because major energy importers in Asia rely heavily on stable supply lines from the Persian Gulf. And among the most important of these importers are countries such as China, India, Japan, and South Korea, which together represent a massive portion of global manufacturing capacity and industrial production, meaning that their economic stability is closely connected to the continuous flow of energy shipments through the Strait of Hormuz.
China, for example, has become one of the world's largest energy consumers, as its economy has grown rapidly over the past several decades, and a significant portion of the oil imported by Chinese refineries originates in the Gulf region and travels through the Strait of Hormuz before reaching Asian ports, which illustrates how a maritime route located thousands of kilometers away from East Asia can still play a decisive role in supporting the economic development of one of the world's largest economies.
India represents another major example of this dependence, because its rapidly expanding population and industrial base require enormous amounts of energy to support transportation, electricity generation, and manufacturing activities. And much of the crude oil imported by India comes from Persian Gulf producers and must pass through the Strait of Hormuz on its journey toward Indian refineries, meaning that stable shipping conditions in this region are essential for maintaining energy supplies that help power India's economic growth.
Japan and South Korea also rely heavily on energy imports from the Gulf region, largely because these countries have limited domestic oil and gas resources, and therefore depend on international markets to supply the energy needed for their advanced industrial economies, which means that LNG carriers and oil tankers traveling through the Strait of Hormuz play a crucial role in ensuring that factories, transportation networks, and power stations in these highly developed nations continue operating smoothly.
When we combine the energy demands of these major economies, it becomes clear that the Strait of Hormuz functions as a central hub in the global energy network, because the resources transported through this route do not remain within one region, but instead travel across vast distances to support economic activity in countries that collectively represent a significant share of the world's population and industrial production.
Another reason why this route is so critical is that energy prices influence almost every sector of modern economies. Because when the price of oil or natural gas rises sharply, the effects are felt far beyond the energy industry itself. Since transportation companies must pay more for fuel, airlines face higher operating costs, shipping firms adjust freight prices, and manufacturers often experience rising production expenses, all of which can gradually influence the prices that consumers pay for goods and services.
This connection between energy prices and economic activity is one of the reasons policymakers closely monitor energy transit routes like the Strait of Hormuz, because even the possibility of disruptions can cause markets to react quickly, and when traders begin to worry about potential supply interruptions, they often adjust their expectations about future energy availability, which can lead to price movements that ripple through financial markets and influence economic planning in many countries.
What makes this situation even more interesting is that energy does not only power vehicles or industrial machines, but also supports the broader infrastructure of modern society, including electricity systems, chemical industries, agricultural production, and global shipping networks, meaning that reliable access to oil and natural gas remains an essential foundation for economic stability and technological development in many parts of the world.
So when we talk about the Strait of Hormuz, we are not simply discussing a narrow channel of water in the Middle East, but rather a crucial link in the global energy chain that connects producers and consumers across continents, and the oil tankers and LNG carriers passing through this corridor every day represent the steady movement of resources that help sustain modern life, from powering transportation systems and generating electricity to enabling factories and industries to operate efficiently.
For our listeners, the key lesson from this discussion is that the importance of the Strait of Hormuz extends far beyond regional politics or maritime geography, because the energy resources moving through this route support the functioning of the global economy itself, demonstrating how interconnected modern societies have become through networks of trade, transportation, and resource exchange.
In other words, the Strait of Hormuz is not simply about oil shipments traveling from one region to another, but about the infrastructure that allows the modern global economy to function smoothly, because the energy transported through this narrow passage helps power factories, fuel transportation networks, generate electricity, and support economic growth in countries all around the world.
And that is why analysts often describe the Strait of Hormuz as one of the most important strategic locations on the planet, because the stability of this single maritime route influences the availability of energy resources that support billions of people and countless industries, reminding us that sometimes a small geographic passage can play an enormous role in shaping the stability and prosperity of the global economy.
If we imagine a situation where the Strait of Hormuz suddenly becomes blocked or ships are unable to pass through safely, the first reactions would likely appear not on the water itself, but inside the global financial system, because modern markets respond to risk almost instantly, and the moment credible reports begin circulating that tanker traffic has stopped moving through this crucial energy corridor, financial analysts, energy traders, and government officials around the world would immediately begin assessing the potential consequences for global energy supply and economic stability.
That is a very important point, Adam, because financial markets operate on expectations and information, and when traders hear news that could affect supply chains or energy availability, they respond extremely quickly, often within minutes rather than hours, which means that if the Strait of Hormuz was suddenly disrupted, one of the first places we would see the reaction would be in the global oil market, where energy traders constantly monitor geopolitical developments that might influence the balance between supply and demand.
Exactly. And in such a situation, oil prices would likely begin rising almost immediately, because traders would start calculating the possibility that a large portion of global oil exports might temporarily become unavailable. And even if the disruption were only expected to last for a short period, the uncertainty alone could create a sharp increase in prices as markets attempt to adjust to the potential risk of reduced supply reaching international buyers.
What many people do not realize is that oil markets are extremely sensitive to geopolitical signals, because traders constantly evaluate news from energy-producing regions and shipping routes in order to estimate future supply conditions. So when an event occurs that threatens a critical transit point like the Strait of Hormuz, market participants often react by purchasing oil contracts at higher prices, anticipating that energy may become more difficult to obtain if shipments are delayed or reduced.
Beyond the energy market itself, the effects would quickly spread into global stock markets as well, because investors understand that rising energy prices can influence many industries, including transportation, manufacturing, and logistics, meaning that companies that depend heavily on fuel or shipping might face higher operating costs, while energy producers could potentially benefit from higher commodity prices, creating a complex pattern of gains and losses across different sectors of the global economy.
This type of reaction often produces what economists call market volatility, which means that financial prices begin moving rapidly as investors reassess risks and opportunities. And in the case of a disruption in the Strait of Hormuz, we might see major stock indexes fluctuate as traders attempt to predict how long the disruption could last and how severely it might affect global supply chains that depend on stable energy transportation.
Currencies could also react during the first 24 hours, because exchange rates often shift when investors begin moving money toward assets or economies that they believe are more stable during periods of uncertainty. And countries that rely heavily on imported energy might experience pressure on their currencies if traders anticipate higher costs for oil and natural gas imports in the near future.
Another important reaction would likely occur within the global shipping industry, because tanker operators and maritime logistics companies constantly monitor security conditions along major trade routes, and if reports suggested that the Strait of Hormuz had become unsafe or inaccessible, many shipping companies would likely pause tanker movements while they wait for clearer information about whether vessels can pass through the area safely and whether international authorities are coordinating responses to stabilize the situation.
This temporary pause in tanker traffic could create additional uncertainty in the market, because even a short interruption in shipping schedules might delay the arrival of energy supplies to refineries and distribution hubs in different parts of the world, which means that energy companies, traders, and governments would immediately begin analyzing inventory levels and exploring whether alternative supply sources could temporarily compensate for the disruption.
Insurance companies would also play a very important role during these early hours, because ships that transport valuable cargoes such as crude oil or liquefied natural gas require specialized maritime insurance. And if a region suddenly becomes associated with higher geopolitical risk, insurers often adjust their risk assessments and premiums, meaning that the cost of insuring ships traveling near that area can increase dramatically in a very short period of time.
These higher insurance costs can have practical consequences for shipping companies, because if insurance premiums rise sharply, it becomes more expensive to send tankers through a potentially unstable region, which may lead some operators to delay voyages until conditions become clearer, further reducing the immediate flow of energy shipments and adding another layer of uncertainty to the global energy market.
When we combine these reactions together, we begin to see how the first 24 hours after a major disruption in the Strait of Hormuz could trigger a chain reaction across multiple sectors of the global economy, starting with energy markets and financial trading, but quickly expanding into shipping logistics, insurance services, currency markets, and international investment decisions.
This process highlights an important characteristic of modern global markets, which is that information moves extremely quickly, and economic actors respond rapidly to potential risks, meaning that even before physical shortages of oil or gas appear, financial markets may already begin adjusting prices and expectations in response to the perceived possibility of future supply disruptions.
For our listeners, this example provides an important lesson about how global economic systems operate, because markets are not only influenced by current supply and demand, but also by expectations about what might happen next, and when uncertainty enters the system through geopolitical events or disruptions to key trade routes. Financial markets often respond immediately as investors attempt to protect themselves from potential losses or position themselves for possible changes in commodity prices.
So the first 24 hours following a disruption in the Strait of Hormuz would likely be characterized by rapid information sharing, intense market activity, and careful monitoring by governments, companies, and financial institutions around the world, all trying to understand whether the situation is temporary or whether it might develop into a longer-term challenge for global energy supply.
And this immediate reaction reminds us that in today's interconnected global economy, events that occur in a relatively small geographic location can quickly influence financial markets, trade networks, and economic expectations across the entire world, demonstrating once again how strategic routes like the Strait of Hormuz play a central role in maintaining the stability of global commerce and energy distribution.
When analysts discuss the possible consequences of a serious disruption in the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most significant concerns is the sudden loss of a large portion of the world's oil supply reaching international markets, because a huge volume of global oil exports travels through this narrow maritime corridor every day, and if tanker movements were interrupted for an extended period of time, the global market could temporarily lose access to roughly 20 million barrels of oil per day that normally flow from the Persian Gulf toward energy-consuming economies across Asia, Europe, and other regions of the world.
That number alone helps us understand why economists and policymakers often describe the Strait of Hormuz as one of the most critical energy transit routes on the planet. Because losing access to such a massive portion of daily oil shipments would create immediate uncertainty in global energy markets, and traders would begin reacting to the possibility that supply might fall far below the level needed to meet current demand, which could cause oil prices to rise very rapidly as buyers compete to secure available resources.
Oil markets are extremely sensitive to sudden changes in supply conditions because the global economy depends heavily on steady and predictable energy flows, and when a disruption threatens a large portion of the supply network, energy traders quickly adjust their expectations about how much oil will be available in the coming weeks or months, which often leads to sharp increases in prices as the market attempts to balance limited supply with ongoing demand from industries, transportation systems, and consumers around the world.
In a scenario where tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz becomes restricted or stops entirely, many analysts believe that oil prices could increase dramatically within a short period of time, not necessarily because the world immediately runs out of energy, but because markets begin pricing in the possibility that supply shortages could appear if the disruption lasts longer than expected. And these expectations alone can create powerful movements in global commodity markets.
This is also the moment when governments begin examining their emergency energy reserves, because many countries maintain what are known as strategic petroleum reserves, which are large stockpiles of oil stored specifically for situations where global supply disruptions threaten economic stability. And these reserves exist as a kind of safety mechanism that allows governments to release additional oil into the market temporarily in order to reduce pressure on prices and ensure that essential sectors continue receiving energy supplies.
Countries such as the United States, China, Japan, and several European economies maintain strategic reserves precisely for moments when geopolitical tensions or supply disruptions create uncertainty in global energy markets. And if shipments through the Strait of Hormuz were suddenly interrupted, policymakers in many capitals would likely begin discussing whether to release part of these reserves in order to stabilize supply while diplomatic and logistical solutions are explored.
However, even with emergency reserves available, the situation could still create significant concern among countries that depend heavily on imported energy, because many industrialized economies rely on regular shipments of oil and natural gas from international suppliers, and if those shipments become uncertain or delayed, energy planners and government officials may begin worrying about whether future deliveries will arrive on time to meet domestic demand.
This sense of supply anxiety can spread quickly through global markets, especially in countries where domestic energy production is limited and imports represent the primary source of fuel for transportation, electricity generation, and industrial activity, because governments and businesses begin asking important questions about how long existing inventories will last and whether alternative suppliers can provide additional resources if traditional shipping routes remain disrupted.
One of the reasons energy disruptions are taken so seriously is that oil prices influence far more than just the energy sector itself, because fuel costs affect transportation networks, shipping industries, airlines, manufacturing operations, and even agricultural production, meaning that when oil prices rise sharply, the effects can spread throughout the entire economy as companies adjust their operating costs and consumers begin paying more for goods and services.
For example, when fuel prices increase significantly, transportation companies must spend more money operating trucks, ships, and airplanes, which often leads to higher shipping costs for businesses that rely on global supply chains. And these increased costs can eventually appear in the prices of everyday products, such as food, clothing, electronics, and many other goods that depend on international logistics systems.
This process is one of the reasons economists frequently connect energy prices with inflation, because rising fuel costs tend to push production and transportation expenses higher across multiple sectors of the economy, which can gradually lead to broader increases in consumer prices as businesses pass some of those additional costs along to customers.
In countries where fuel plays a particularly important role in daily life, higher energy prices can also influence household budgets directly, because people may spend more on transportation, heating, and electricity, meaning that the economic effects of an energy disruption are not limited to governments or large corporations, but can also be felt by ordinary consumers as they notice rising prices in many areas of the economy.
Another important factor is that energy markets are deeply interconnected, so disruptions in oil supply often influence the prices of related energy sources, such as natural gas and refined petroleum products, which means that an interruption in one part of the global energy system can gradually affect multiple markets at the same time as traders attempt to rebalance supply and demand across different energy resources.
All of these reactions illustrate how closely the global economy is tied to the stability of energy transportation routes. Because when a major transit corridor like the Strait of Hormuz experiences disruption, the consequences extend far beyond the region itself and begin influencing prices, production decisions, and economic expectations in countries located thousands of kilometers away.
So the key lesson from this discussion is that energy supply disruptions do not remain isolated events within the oil industry, but instead ripple outward through transportation networks, manufacturing systems, financial markets, and consumer economies. demonstrating how central energy flows are to the functioning of modern global society.
And this is precisely why policymakers, economists, and international organizations closely monitor strategic maritime routes like the Strait of Hormuz, because the stability of these routes helps ensure that energy resources continue moving smoothly across global markets, supporting economic growth and reducing the risk of sudden price shocks that could affect industries and households around the world. When we begin examining the broader economic consequences of a disruption in the Strait of Hormuz, it quickly becomes clear that the crisis would not remain limited to energy markets alone, because modern economies are deeply connected through transportation networks and supply chains. And once fuel prices begin rising due to supply concerns, transportation costs across the world start increasing as well, which means that ships, trucks, trains, and airplanes transporting goods between countries would suddenly face higher operating expenses, creating a ripple effect that gradually spreads through many different sectors of the global economy.
One of the first industries to feel this pressure would likely be the airline sector, because aviation depends heavily on jet fuel derived from petroleum products, and when oil prices increase sharply, airlines must pay significantly more to operate their fleets, which can force companies to raise ticket prices, adjust flight schedules, or manage higher operating costs that affect their profitability, demonstrating how an energy disruption in one region can influence travel and transportation networks that connect cities and countries around the world.
Another industry closely tied to energy costs is global shipping, because large cargo vessels transporting manufactured goods, raw materials, and consumer products rely on fuel to cross oceans and deliver goods between continents. And when fuel prices rise, the cost of operating these ships increases as well, meaning that shipping companies may adjust freight rates in order to cover their expenses, which eventually affects the prices that businesses must pay to move products through international trade routes.
Manufacturing industries would also experience the consequences of rising energy costs, because factories depend on energy not only to power machines and production lines, but also to transport raw materials and distribute finished products. And if oil prices increase significantly, companies may face higher expenses for electricity, transportation, and logistics, which can influence production costs and ultimately affect the prices of many goods that consumers purchase every day.
Food markets are another area where the effects could become visible, because modern agriculture and food distribution systems rely heavily on transportation networks that move crops, fertilizers, and packaged foods across large distances. And when fuel prices rise, farmers, distributors, and retailers may all experience higher costs for moving products from farms to markets, which can gradually lead to increases in food prices for consumers in different parts of the world.
This is one of the reasons economists often describe energy as a foundational input in the global economy, because energy costs influence so many aspects of production and distribution, meaning that when energy prices rise, the effects can spread widely across sectors such as transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, and retail, creating economic pressure that affects businesses and households alike.
As these rising costs spread through the economy, many countries may begin experiencing stronger inflation pressures, because inflation occurs when the general level of prices increases across a wide range of goods and services, and higher fuel costs can contribute to this process by increasing the expenses associated with producing and transporting products, which eventually appear in the prices consumers see in stores and markets.
In advanced industrial economies, governments and central banks often monitor inflation closely and may adjust economic policies to maintain stability, but in many developing countries, the situation can become more challenging because these economies sometimes rely heavily on imported energy and may have fewer financial resources available to cushion the impact of sudden increases in global fuel prices.
For developing nations that depend on imported oil to power transportation systems, electricity generation, and industrial activity, higher energy costs can place significant pressure on national budgets and household spending, which means that the economic stress created by a disruption in a distant maritime route, like the Strait of Hormuz, can still influence economic stability and living costs in countries far beyond the Middle East.
All of these examples highlight an important lesson about the modern global economy, which is that supply chains and economic systems are deeply interconnected, and when a disruption occurs in a critical energy transit route, it can trigger a chain reaction that spreads through transportation networks, production systems, and consumer markets around the world, reminding us that the stability of global trade routes plays a vital role in maintaining economic balance and cooperation between nations. When a major disruption threatens one of the most important maritime routes in the global energy system, the reaction would not come only from markets and businesses, but also from governments and international institutions, because major powers understand that the stability of global trade routes is closely connected to economic security, and if shipping through the Strait of Hormuz were suddenly blocked or significantly restricted, diplomatic activity among leading countries would likely intensify very quickly as leaders begin coordinating responses designed to protect global energy flows and prevent a wider economic crisis.
That is an important point, Adam, because throughout modern history, countries have recognized that keeping international sea routes open is essential for maintaining global commerce and economic stability, and maritime passages like the Strait of Hormuz function as vital corridors connecting producers and consumers across continents, which means that disruptions in these locations can quickly become international concerns rather than purely regional issues.
Among the countries that would likely become deeply involved in responding to such a situation is the United States, because it has long maintained a strong interest in ensuring the stability of global shipping lanes and energy supplies, and American diplomatic and security institutions often work with international partners to monitor maritime routes, coordinate naval patrols, and support efforts aimed at protecting the free flow of commerce through critical waterways.
At the same time, China would also pay very close attention to developments in the region, because the Chinese economy imports large quantities of oil from the Middle East and relies on stable maritime routes to transport those resources toward its industrial centers and coastal refineries, which means that any disruption affecting shipments from the Persian Gulf would naturally attract the attention of Chinese policymakers and energy planners.
European countries would also have strong incentives to support efforts aimed at stabilizing the situation, because many members of the European Union depend on global energy markets for oil and natural gas supplies that support transportation networks, manufacturing industries, and electricity generation systems, meaning that maintaining secure trade routes remains a shared economic priority for many European governments.
India is another major economy that would closely monitor developments around the Strait of Hormuz, because a large portion of its imported energy originates from the Gulf region and must travel through this maritime passage before reaching Indian ports. And as India's economy continues growing, its need for reliable energy supplies remains an important factor in its broader economic planning and international partnerships.
In situations where global shipping routes face serious disruptions, international naval cooperation often becomes an important part of the response strategy, because maritime security operations can help monitor conditions, escort commercial vessels when necessary, and ensure that shipping lanes remain safe for civilian trade, and many countries maintain naval forces capable of working together through coordinated missions designed to protect the movement of goods across international waters.
This type of cooperation demonstrates how interconnected global economic interests have become, because countries that may compete in some areas of international politics often still share a common interest in maintaining stable trade routes and protecting maritime infrastructure that supports the global economy. And safeguarding these routes helps ensure that energy shipments, commercial cargo, and humanitarian supplies can continue reaching their destinations.
Another important aspect of the response would involve diplomatic communication between governments, because resolving disruptions in strategic waterways usually requires dialogue, negotiation, and coordination among regional actors as well as major global powers, and international organizations may also play roles in encouraging cooperation, promoting transparency, and supporting efforts aimed at reducing tensions while restoring safe navigation conditions.
For our listeners, this discussion highlights an important lesson about international relations, which is that maritime security and economic stability are often shared concerns among many countries, and when a critical shipping route faces uncertainty, cooperation between governments, navies, and international institutions becomes essential for protecting global trade networks and ensuring that the energy systems supporting modern economies remain stable and reliable. When we examine the global dependence on the Strait of Hormuz, a natural question immediately comes to mind, and that is whether the world could simply move oil and gas through different routes if this narrow waterway became unavailable for some period of time. Because in a global economy that relies heavily on energy transportation, governments and energy companies constantly study backup options and alternative supply paths in order to reduce the risks that might emerge if a critical maritime corridor suddenly faces disruption.
That question leads us to an important part of the discussion, because although the Strait of Hormuz is the main export route for energy shipments from the Persian Gulf, there are indeed a few alternative infrastructure systems that have been developed over the years, particularly pipelines that transport oil across land to ports located outside the strait, allowing some energy exports to reach international markets without passing directly through this strategic maritime passage.
Many listeners might not realize that several energy-producing countries in the region have invested in pipeline networks precisely to create these kinds of alternatives, because relying entirely on a single shipping route always carries risks, and energy planners often prefer having multiple transportation options available in order to strengthen supply security and maintain stable exports, even if geopolitical tensions affect certain areas.
One of the most notable examples can be found in Saudi Arabia, which operates major oil pipelines that transport crude oil from production fields in the eastern part of the country across the Arabian Peninsula toward ports located along the Red Sea coast, allowing tankers to load oil there and ship it toward global markets without traveling through the Strait of Hormuz, which provides the country with a degree of flexibility during periods of regional uncertainty.
Another example comes from the United Arab Emirates, which has also developed pipeline infrastructure connecting oil fields in the interior of the country to export terminals located along the Gulf of Oman, meaning that some shipments can reach open ocean routes without entering the narrow waters of the Strait of Hormuz, demonstrating that energy producers in the region have already taken steps to create limited alternatives for transporting their resources.
However, it is important to understand that these alternative routes have limited capacity compared with the enormous volume of oil that normally moves through the Strait of Hormuz each day, because the pipelines currently in operation are capable of transporting only a portion of the region's total exports, which means that even if they operate at full capacity, they cannot fully replace the massive shipping flow that typically passes through the strait.
This limitation means that if the strait was suddenly unavailable, only a relatively small share of the oil normally exported through the region could be redirected quickly through these alternative systems, while the majority of shipments would still depend on the reopening of maritime routes, highlighting how central this narrow waterway remains to the global energy transportation network.
The broader lesson from this discussion is that while alternative pipelines and export terminals do provide some flexibility and resilience within the energy system, they cannot completely replace the role of the Strait of Hormuz, which is why many countries also focus on long-term strategies, such as energy diversification, developing multiple supply sources and transportation options in order to reduce vulnerability and maintain greater stability in the global energy market. Julia, when we look beyond the immediate economic shock and the first 24 or 48 hours of a disruption in the Strait of Hormuz, it becomes clear that such a crisis could have profound long-term effects on global energy policy and international economic strategy, because governments and companies tend to respond to repeated risks by adjusting their priorities and investing in alternatives that reduce vulnerability, which means that policymakers might accelerate efforts to diversify energy sources and improve resilience across supply chains.
I completely agree, Adam, because a disruption of this magnitude serves as a wake-up call for governments around the world, highlighting the dangers of over-reliance on a single strategic choke point. And we often see that after such events, countries intensify investments in renewable energy, such as solar, wind, and hydroelectric power, not only to reduce carbon emissions, but also to limit dependence on imported fossil fuels that must traverse risky maritime routes.
Exactly. And along with renewables, many nations might also invest more in nuclear power as a stable, high-capacity energy source that can provide continuous electricity without the uncertainty associated with imported oil and gas, because nuclear energy offers a long-term solution that strengthens energy independence and helps countries shield their economies from the volatility of global fossil fuel markets.
I agree with that completely, Adam. And another key response is the expansion and modernization of strategic petroleum reserves, because governments that maintain large stockpiles of oil can release supplies during crises to stabilize markets. And after experiencing the risks associated with a blocked strait, many countries would likely review and increase the size of these reserves to ensure that future disruptions do not create the same level of economic shock.
Yes, and beyond these specific investments, a crisis like this could also accelerate the global energy transition, because nations and companies may view diversification not just as a technical necessity, but as a strategic imperative, leading to long-term changes in energy policy, infrastructure development, and international cooperation to ensure that economies remain resilient in the face of geopolitical uncertainty.
Absolutely, Adam. And governments would also seek to reduce reliance on risky choke points by investing in alternative pipelines, port infrastructure, and regional energy partnerships, because avoiding overdependence on a single narrow route becomes a priority when the economic consequences of disruption are so visible and widespread. And this strategy also strengthens global energy security by spreading risk across multiple channels and technologies.
I fully confirm that, Julia. We are likely to see a future in which countries increasingly integrate renewable energy, nuclear power, and strategic reserves into a comprehensive energy strategy, because lessons learned from crises like a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz highlight that resilience and flexibility are essential for economic stability and national security in a highly interconnected world.
And I also confirm that, Adam. The long-term impact of such crises is not just economic, but also geopolitical, because countries may re-evaluate alliances, strengthen maritime cooperation, and shift toward more diversified energy policies, showing that crises often act as catalysts for major permanent changes in the way the world produces, transports, and consumes energy, ultimately reshaping global economic strategy for decades to come.
As we bring today's discussion to a close, Julia, it's clear that the story of the Strait of Hormuz offers us many lessons about the intersection of geography, economics, and global strategy, because the location of this narrow waterway has long influenced the balance of power, the flow of energy resources, and the policies of nations that rely on its stability, reminding us that geography is never just about maps. It shapes decisions that affect millions of people around the world.
I completely agree, Adam. And we've seen throughout today's discussion that energy routes like the Strait of Hormuz directly influence economic stability, because when oil and gas cannot move freely, it affects industries, transportation, markets, and even everyday costs for people thousands of miles away, which shows that a single choke point can have ripple effects that touch almost every corner of the global economy.
Exactly, Julia. Another crucial lesson is that markets react almost instantly to uncertainty, whether it's through rising oil prices, stock market volatility, or shifts in currency values, demonstrating how interconnected the modern global economy has become and how even small disruptions in a strategic location can produce immediate consequences far beyond the region itself.
And this is why cooperation between nations is absolutely essential, Adam, because no single country can fully manage the flow of global energy alone. Diplomatic dialogue, naval coordination, and strategic planning are all necessary to ensure that trade routes remain secure, energy supplies remain stable, and the global economy continues to function despite regional tensions.
Yes, Julia. And for our listeners, one key takeaway is that understanding these global dynamics is not only about following breaking news or analyzing economics, it's also about seeing the world in a connected way, where politics, geography, and commerce interact continuously to shape our everyday lives.
I would also like to encourage everyone listening to follow world news carefully and think critically about the events you read about or hear in the media, because informed perspectives help you understand the decisions made by countries, the strategies behind energy and trade, and the risks and opportunities that affect all of us in the global community.
And finally, for those of you who are learning English, engaging with topics like today's discussion provides a unique opportunity to improve your language skills while thinking about real-world issues, because following global events encourages vocabulary development, comprehension, and analytical thinking in a meaningful and practical context.
Exactly, Adam. So, as we reflect on the Strait of Hormuz and the lessons we've explored today, remember that knowledge of global affairs helps us not only understand the world, but also communicate effectively, think critically, and continue learning English in a way that is both educational and highly relevant to the issues shaping our modern lives.